We wanted to take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, Olson. Founded in 1956 on the very mindset that drives them today, Olson seeks to improve communities by making them more sustainable, better connected, and more efficient. Simply put, they work to leave the world better than they found it. Olson can perform professional services nationwide and has more than 2,000 professionals offering a comprehensive list of services including planning and design, engineering, field services, environmental, and technology. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Booked on Planning. In today's episode, we're covering Walkable City by Jeff Speck. We had so much to talk about, we decided to break this episode into two parts, so keep an eye out for episode 2 coming out the same time next week. In 2012, Jeff's book sounded the alarm that cars are the central problem of American life and that making downtown more walkable is a necessary fix for the typical American city. 10 years later, following COVID and the rise of rideshare, and the escalating climate crisis, Speck returned with a 10th anniversary edition that assesses the impacts of these events and the changes that have taken place since the original book was published. Jennifer, I thought our conversation with Jeff was really interesting, so much so that we talked for over an hour and are breaking the episode into two parts, as I mentioned. We touched on a lot of aspects of planning, including housing, economic development, transit, walkability, biking, and Carmageddon.
I agree, Stephanie. I honestly felt like we could have kept talking to Jeff for hours and still would have had more to talk about. I found the discussion around biking to be very interesting. I grew up miles from town, so biking wasn't really a priority to me. And when I read Walkable City 10 years ago, I actually agreed with Jeff's original premise. But after reading the book and then talking about the increase in bike advocacy, I think it has been incredibly interesting to watch the biking community elevate the importance of cycling as part of a multimodal transportation system.
Yeah, and he discussed in the book, and we talk about it in our conversation as well, about how biking is probably the one section of his original book that changed the most, and that his opinions on biking and allocating space in cities for bike infrastructure has really grown since 10 years ago.
Well, let's get into our conversation with Jeff Speck on his book, Walkable City.
First, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Walkable City, which has just been reprinted for the 10th anniversary with updated content. Can you start off by telling us what prompted the reprint?
My pleasure. Yeah, and it's been constantly in print. And one of the reasons for a new edition was that it's still selling about as well as it was when it started. So it's been a great pleasure to me and a bit of a surprise. All I really knew when I first wrote it was that there are things I felt I needed to communicate and share with planners and with folks who aren't planners about planning. And I was just astounded by how popular it became. And my publisher was very happy with that and said, Jeff, would you want to do something to keep it fresh? And, the book was written based on principles that are fairly timeless in the modern American city and suburb. But in fact, as we can discuss, some things have changed. And most notably, I think American bicycle planning technology has advanced faster than anything else that has been changing in this country and in planning. So that needed our attention. So much has happened in the last 10 years. And my strategy whenever I write something is, as I go through the years, probably like most of you, as I go through the years, I read articles, I learn things, I hear about studies, I have the experience of doing projects, and I discover things I didn't know before. And there were 10 years of that I had been taking notes on and felt compelled to communicate. And of course, some very specific developments in the last 10 years that were not understood or anticipated in 2011 when I was doing most of the writing of Walkable City, including, of course, COVID, including a housing crisis that has spiraled out of control, and myself becoming aware through the color of law and other conversations about the ongoing housing crisis surrounding inequity, right? So that needed conversation. Uber and Lyft came along and had some real impacts in cities and some real misleading, I think, marketing and verbiage around their business model. And then autonomous vehicles continue to be a future that will probably never come, but will only come in a dystopian form. I'm quite convinced. I read a study this morning for the first time where some academic group, I forget where, said enough speculation about how AVs are going to impact driver behavior. Let's just make fake AVs. And they put dozens of people in their own cars and offered them a driver. So they essentially turned people's cars into self-driving cars for a number of weeks and found that vehicle miles traveled went up 83%. So, we've been speculating for a decade now, or almost, maybe. And, for as long as we've been hearing about AVs, we planners have been speculating that it would be a complete, VMT bomb. And in fact, that's what the data are showing us so far. But anyway, a lot of things like that came to my attention in the last 10 years. And so there were some things I wanted to correct, but more to the point, I really wanted the book to be a book for the 2020s and not just for the 2010s.
So this next question is kind of a two-part based on your response there. The first is, so the way you structured this update was to leave the original chapters, and then you added the section at the end that discussed everything that's changed in the last 10 years. And then you pointed out that one of the sections that changed the most in the last 10 years was bicycling within communities. So I'm curious why you chose to approach the update the way you did, and then why do you think bicycling is the one section that changed the most as compared to all the other sections?
I had the intention originally of rewriting the whole book. And I lectured with Anne Hidalgo and John Kerry. I participated in a climate conference in Chantilly in France over a year ago. And they didn't really have a budget for speakers, but they did offer to put me up in a hotel in Paris for a week after the conference. And I said, that's a good deal. So I brought the book to Paris and started to rewrite it and just failed miserably, because what I relearned, was that book is mostly stories. The way that's best to communicate information is through stories. And of course, it was based on a lot of things that were in the news in the decade before I wrote it. And there weren't always modern day counterparts to replace those old stories with, and the old stories were still valid. So after a couple of days kind of banging my head against the wall while strolling wonderfully and dining fabulously in Paris, but being quite frustrated, I realized that changing the initial book, which, if it ain't broke, why fix it, was a less wise approach than just supplementing it. I think there was one little chapter that we removed, and that was a little subchapter. And that was about Zipcar, because Zipcar was a brand new phenomenon at the time of the book, and then it's no longer such a big deal anymore. So I think I removed a little bit about Zipcar, but then everything else is an addition. The only place where I kind of regret some of the things, or maybe one thing that I said in the initial text, which I haven't changed, but I comment on, was that, I was being very practical about bikes. And I had a sentence something like, creating a proper bicycle infrastructure within a city does not mean handing the cycling lobby a piece of every single street tied up neatly with a bow. Basically feeling that, the pressure that one feels as a planner to satisfy every constituent group, and understanding that cyclists, a group to which I belong, is one constituent group. And that if you give everyone what they want in every street, of course, you end up with streets that are the size of airport runways. So I think I was feeling a little bit resentful when I wrote that. And in truth, it's still accurate, which is to say that, you go to a place like Copenhagen, and the bigger streets have specified designated kind of half sidewalk level bike lanes in them. But the typical bike way in a city like Copenhagen is just mixing with traffic on properly designed, really slow speed streets, right? And most of the streets in our cities should be designed so slow that you don't need bike lanes. But in any case, I think that I had a little bit of a snarky attitude about the needs of cyclists. If I can do a very short reading, if I can be authorial
Yes.
That's a word.
It is booked on planning.
Yes. Here's 2 paragraphs from the update, which explains exactly what I was talking about. If there's one passage of the book that I would like to retract, it's step 6 is don't get greedy. Sure, bike advocates are specialists, and we need our cities to be designed by generalists. As I noticed, there isn't enough room in the streets for every specialist to get what they want. But here's what I got wrong. I have yet to see a city do anything requested by a bike advocate that has not made that city better for everyone. I've finally been to Copenhagen and biked miles of downtown without the slightest fear for my 8 and 10-year-old boys in front of me. If you haven't had that life-changing experience, don't begin to think you know what you are doing when you do not deny a cyclist anything. The cycling city is the city we all need, and remembering Copenhagen fills me alternately with joy and rage. Just today, Milan announced $271 million in funding for a 466-mile citywide bike network. Paris recently upped its biking investment to $500 million in order to achieve an 100% cycling city. Meanwhile, the Boston Cyclists Union clamors enthusiastically for an increase in the city's bike budget to $2.6 million. And Boston's one of the good ones. So get greedy. Don't settle for scraps. Demand more, 100 times more, and don't stop until the very last bike-hating motorist throws up their hands and decamps permanently for the suburbs. So that was my update to the biking chapter. I have to say there wasn't much else in the book that I felt I needed to correct. But then the other aspect of that, which I talk about in this new chapter called Cycling Ascendant, is, of course, how the technology has improved so much. 10 years ago, I would stripe a door zone bike lane. I won't do that anymore. I won't put a bike lane in a door zone. 10 years ago, that was okay because it was so much better than what we were getting normally. Nowadays, my colleagues and I will typically only create a bike lane that's either protected by parked cars or not adjacent to parked cars. And of course, if it's protected by parked cars, you have the buffer zone. And then in more and more of our projects, honestly, if we're rebuilding a street or making a new street, and that street has significant volume, we will put the bike lane up on the sidewalk edge. And ideally, we'll do a Copenhagen-style bike lane, which means it's up kind of halfway. It's about a 3 or 4 inch curb, as opposed to a 6 or 7 inch curb, which is a wonderful way to install bike infrastructure. So it's been great to witness, as I'm sure you have as well, the fact that we're finally getting bike infrastructure in the U.S. that's as good as what they had in Germany in 1988.
Yeah, as a active transportation planner who's trying to get more good cycling infrastructure in Lincoln, I really enjoyed the 2 paragraphs that you read. It's very uplifting.
Well, it's true. I mean, the biking city is the best city for everyone, even if you don't bike.
I don't bike as much, and I agree. Building off of your opening comments too, I also wanted to talk a little bit about Carmageddon, and I had to laugh at myself. I used to have an hour and 20-minute drive to work, and being a solid Nebraskan, I believed that the AV apocalypse would probably happen before we would build any kind of rail transportation between Lincoln and Omaha. And so then reading through your book and being introduced to your concept of Carmageddon made me feel like a really bad planner for a few minutes, wishing that I just had an AV to drive me between Lincoln and Omaha. So can you talk a little bit about Carmageddon and how it didn't play out how people thought it would, but it played out exactly how you thought it would?
Well, I'm hardly unique in this understanding. I should say that if you read my Twitter feed, if you read the things I get when I tune into Twitter, it would seem that everyone that's thinking understands the concept of an induced demand. And in a podcast for planners, I don't think I need to explain what induced demand is or how it works. But in the expanded edition of Walkable City, I talk about, and here I'm quoting Joe Courtwright, Portland's Joe Courtwright, who had an article in Streets Blog, I believe, that said Carmageddon never comes, the Alaska Way example. Now, in the first edition of Walkable City, I told the story of the Alaska Way and how I was hosting a Mayor's Institute on City Design when Mayor Nichols came to the Institute. We had 8 designers, planners around the table and 8 mayors, and he presented the Alaska Way and said, we're considering building a tunnel, we're considering keeping the viaduct. They hadn't yet, this is a long time ago. They hadn't yet figured out what to do with this monstrosity. At that point, they were planning to take. They thought, they suspected they were going to take it down and build a surface parkway, or like a gentle, lovely surface street, and also build a tunnel. And all of us around the table, as I tell the story in the initial edition, all of us around the table, who were from different backgrounds, but we all had planning experience. We said, that's a great plan, except you don't need the tunnel. There's actually, if you do the parkway right as a proper boulevard, then it will absorb the traffic that the highway is currently handling. People will adjust their behavior, as they always have, as they did when the West Side Highway came down, as they did when the Embarcadero Freeway came down, as they did when the Changye-Chen Expressway came down. People will adjust their behavior. And in fact, providing that public transportation alternatives are also offered as part of the package, there will not be any crisis. There will not be any moment. There will not be any Carmageddon. There will not be any moment of crisis. So, of course, he didn't take our advice. And there were a number of political cycles that ultimately led to the tunnel winning the day. The tunnel was built. Big Bertha famously stalled and caused all kinds of problems and overruns and incredible expenses as it dug that tunnel. But there was a period where they had to shut the highway in order to transition people to the tunnel and then build their surface boulevard. And doom and gloom was predicted and never happened. And the traffic just found another way. And it wasn't even a problem on parallel routes locally, right? That the problem never happened. Yes, people adjusted their behavior, but they did so in kind of a painless way, as you always see. And then they opened the tunnel now. And of course, now they have a double capacity. And this is what really kills me. This is kind of a side discussion. But they made the mistake of letting the same old engineers design that surface street. So they put the highway underground. That allows you to make whatever kind of surface street you want. You're removing this incredible barrier between the city and the waterfront, and you can put anything there. And they basically put another highway there. I had the same experience in Oklahoma City. They tore down a highway. They moved it, right, about a half mile south of where it was, the 405, I believe. And I was on the team that was, quote unquote, redesigning the trajectory of that moved highway to be a boulevard. But unfortunately, the DOT was in charge. The deal that the city made with the DOT was, and you can see why the city liked this, that the DOT would hand them over a lovely surface street. But when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you're a DOT, every street looks like a highway. And that's also what happened in Seattle. And to add insult to injury, the streets in Seattle have the street trees on the wrong side of the sidewalk. So they don't even protect the pedestrians from cars. It's amazing how badly street planning is done in the US, street design. And let me just add one thing I discovered recently, because I've been fighting, and this isn't in the book. I've been, fighting DOTs and trying to sway the practices of street engineers for 30 years. And I just presumed that they were trained. Like, I presumed that there was some education in what they did that gave them the authority to make the standards and the decisions that they make every day. I learned only recently that if you're practicing traffic engineering, you don't have a degree in traffic engineering. You have a degree in civil engineering. If you have a degree in civil engineering, you're lucky to have taken one course in traffic engineering. And you're lucky to have taken one class, one day in traffic safety, one day. And that day inevitably focused on highway safety, not local street safety, which of course is an entirely different science. And let me just elaborate for 1 second on that, which is on a highway in which people's speed is determined by the speed limit, in which you get on the highway, you look for the speed limit sign, and you set your cruise control for 9 miles an hour over the speed limit, if you're me. Anything you can do to increase elbow room, anything you can do to remove opportunities for conflict, wider lanes, no trees, no opposing travel, no intersections, big, long, swoopy curves as opposed to tight curves, right? Anything you can do to create a forgiving facility makes the streets safer. And that's what these engineers all learned. These are the same engineers now who apply that thinking to city streets, where actually everything you can do that increases elbow room and increases forgiveness makes people drive faster. And speed is the greatest determinant of pedestrian and cyclist injury in these urban places. And so, I mean, to the degree that, a car going 35 miles an hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. It's an incredibly geometric progression that happens there. And so even recently, I've had to deal with engineers who will tell me, no, the street has to be wider to make it safer, with zero understanding of the fact that environment impacts behavior, which, by the way, is the same nature of the problem that they have with traffic predictions. This whole induced demand conversation is also an ignorance of the fact that environment impacts behavior. None of their models take into account that, oh, if we reduce capacity and congestion increases, people might drive less. Or more importantly, the opposite, right? That increasing capacity causes more driving. So this lack of awareness of feedback loops and second order impacts, and this refusal to understand that speed is a function in urban environments, speed is a function of the environment and not speed limits, causes this extremely uneducated profession to just be making incredibly dangerous standards, such that it's 4 times as dangerous to be a pedestrian or cyclist in the US as it is in Europe. And, the last 12 years, the number of pedestrians killed in traffic has gone up 82%, while in Europe, it's been steadily declining. And we can talk more about that. Unfortunately, it's mostly SUVs, but a huge factor has been the way that we design our roads, so that the onset of SUVs has had a much bigger impact than it otherwise would have had, literally and figuratively, because our roads are designed to welcome high speeds.
I was just going to ask, so knowing that the SS4A grants just all got announced and there's tons of new communities that are going to be doing these Vision Zero plans and focusing on how to improve safety, do you think that engineers will still stick to the old way of doing things? Or do you think that this direction from National DOT is going to kind of push engineers to stop thinking that way and to understand that the way they design impacts speeds?
Well, there's already, and I learned most of the stuff from engineers, right? So there's already a bunch of engineers who don't think that way, but they're in a distinct minority. I have no doubt that these grants may call the attention of a few more engineers to the fact that the standards are bad, but that won't change the fact that the standards are bad. And so what really needs to change, and I know that, NACTO is working on this, right? The National Association of City Transportation Officials is working on changing the standards and changing the MUTCD, right? The Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is so dangerously drawn up. And we could talk about its flaws. But, I think that I don't want to speculate, but it's my suspicion, and the echoes I'm hearing is that the capacity they have to change those documents in the drastic way that they need to be changed is not really there, right? They'll be nibbling around the edges. So you ask a great question, because I have an editorial. If all goes as planned, it's coming out early next week in The Hill newspaper, which is a very widely read political journal in DC. And I talk about, I'll give you a little quote from the op-ed, but I say, last week's announcement from Pete Buttigieg of $800 million in grants to reduce traffic deaths, with $1.1 billion more on the way, gave city planners and pedestrian safety advocates something to celebrate. This investment could not be more needed, but there's a catch. For every deadly street that these grants make safer, American engineers continued to build untold dozens of new streets that are just as deadly. The problem is not just a few streets, but rather an entrenched apparatus of practices and standards that actively welcome dangerous driving. For this reason, only a dramatic change to the traffic engineering profession itself will produce the safer cities and towns that Americans want and need. So that's where I stand there. You're finding that almost any question you have for me, I've written something about.
That's wonderful, because it just gives us more to read and talk about at the end of the day. And I actually think that really gets to a point that I've thought of a lot. And I used to work at an engineering firm. And for Christmas one year, I gave all of my engineers Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Traffic Engineer.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been recent, because that book only came out like a year ago.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it's a great book, and I quote it extensively in my update. And I love Chuck. How did they react? How did they react to that book? Did they read it and did they poo-poo it?
Well, to be fair, I left relatively shortly after I gave it to them, but they did.
You're immediately
laugh.
fired. Yes.
Yes, that's what it was. They did actually laugh. Yes. But I don't know that any of them have actually read it. I'll have to follow up with them. And one of the issues that I have thought of over the years, and that's when Stephanie thought up this podcast, is I'm not sure that planners are always the best communicators. I think that that's something that you're working on. It was something that struck me in the opening paragraphs of your book as you were talking about planners screaming from the rooftops about walkable cities, but it wasn't planners that were able to bring it to light. It was more epidemiologists and other different professions. And so I was wondering how you felt we could help, or how the planning profession could start working on communication skills, or why we're not very good communicators when our entire job is supposed to be communicating.
Yeah, so as I also say in the first edition of Walkable City, almost nothing in that book is original. But what I've seen as my role in this profession is to listen and to read a ton and to hear the best planners and planner allies sell their best ideas the best ways they know how, and to write it down and then to repeat it and repeat it over and over again. And, there is no shame with different audiences being a broken record. And at a certain point, I feel a bit like Lynyrd Skynyrd on stage and everyone's shouting for Freebird. And I'm sick of doing Freebird. But the fact is that, if Freebird is induced demands, or if Freebird is protected bike lanes, or whatever it may be, people need to hear that. And it's absolutely fine to repeat it. I've pretty much, I've done the best I can to figure out the best way to sell every good thing that we want. Well, parallel parking, that's an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalks from moving vehicles, right? I mean, name something else. Like I've got the phrase for each one, and I worked really hard to refine those, and I use them over and over and over again. So I wish I had a more subtle and less kind of self-aggrandizing way to say this to you, but I believe the best way that planners can communicate is to read my damn books and just copy what I say, because I didn't make this stuff up. I'm channeling the best communicators that I've ever known, and I'm, about to be 60 years old, and I've known a lot of them. So that's been my strategy. And it's not just planners, obviously, as you say, the best stories supporting walkable cities, which, by the way, weren't called walkable cities. That's kind of a newish term. We had a lot of different words for it. We'll talk about that. But the best advocates for the kind of cities we wanted were epidemiologists, environmentalists, and economists. And then also now there's tremendously powerful equity arguments and social arguments, sociability arguments for the walkable city. And I always use those arguments, and the best versions, of course, come not from planners, but from folks who are in those specific professions. So, Walkable City had three reasons. The why walkability, the first chunk of the book, was the environmental, the economic, and the epidemiological arguments for making cities more walkable. In the update, I bring up more of the social conversation, and also I bring up equity, which I neglected, I think, I didn't stress enough in the first edition. But these are all such powerful concepts, and they have great ways to advocate. And then the thing I was going to add was that I didn't come up with what kills me is I can't remember when I decided that walkable city or walkability was the best word to describe this. I did not. Obviously, I didn't come up with the word, but also I never made a decision that the walkable city was the best way to describe this, but at a certain point, it just happened. And it's definitely the term of art. Like, it's new urbanism is great, but no one understands what that means. Best practices in planning, what does that mean? We used to call it neo-traditional town planning. The folks who founded new urbanism first called it neo-traditional town planning. None of those terms really do it. You can say livable city, you can say 15-minute city, which you then need to explain. But I think I picked the winner. I didn't create the winner, but I think I picked the winner with walkable city. And it's wonderful for me, right? Because now I'm associated with this term that everyone likes. So I think it's the word that explains what I didn't really fully understand was the foundation of good planning. So at first I embraced walkable city because it was the best way to sell what we were doing. But then, okay, let's put our money where our mouth is. If we're trying to make the city more walkable, what does that mean? And that actually causes you to have much clearer vision when you make choices about what you're going to do in your city. If you're defining as an unmitigated good the idea that you're making your city more walkable and or more bikeable, that leads you towards certain decisions that you might not reach so quickly if you don't name it.
I think that's a good point. Walkable. I mean, people understand walking. It's a very easy term versus some of the other jargony terms that our profession tends to lean on as shorthand. So using terms and benefits that people understand, it's some of our planning benefits of safety are more broad, but people understand health because it impacts them every day. They can see if they're getting healthier, if they're walking more.
Yeah.
And so it's a little easier to connect with. So jumping back to the original chapters, you discuss 4 aspects for walking to be successful, and that's to be useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. How did you come to settle on these 4, and what influenced your thinking on these topics?
Again, I wish my memory was better. I don't think that I invented that. Have you guys been to a Congress for New Urbanism?
I have not.
What's wonderful about CNU from the very beginning, and it's in the spirit of the founders of Andre Stwani, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, Liz Moule, Steph Polyzoides, Peter Calthorpe, and Daniel Solomon, and all the rest of us who gathered first starting in 1993, is that we just share. No one copyrights anything. Nobody gets jealous if anyone takes anyone else's idea. I make very clear in the acknowledgments to Walkable City that almost everything in there I learned from other folks. And unfortunately, I can't remember who or what. I don't think there was anyone who actually said to me, these are the 4 things. We have to focus on the 4 things. But it kind of, it was what was distilled out of the ether as we were all talking about this. And I think it still holds. It's what I call my general theory of walkability with a little wink. But I think it qualifies as a proper theory, which is a hypothesis which is repeatedly tested and refined as necessary. I think those 4 things really does sum it up really well. For this audience, I probably don't need to go into what each one of them means, but the idea that the walk has to serve some purpose, that it not be deadly, that spaces are properly shaped into what we call outdoor living rooms so that people are not uncomfortable in them, and properly, cooled and sometimes heated or protected from the wind by the buildings around them. And then finally, that there's variety and there's interest and there's not blank walls. There's not parking decks that are unhidden parking lots. Those do seem to be the key ingredients to allow people to make the choice to walk. And, a lot of people don't have a choice, and it's my job to advocate for those people who don't have a choice. But the fact is that, it's majorities in cities, and sadly enough, it's wealthy majorities in cities that determine the shape of cities. And so if we can't create a city in which people are making the choice, people who have a choice are making the choice to walk, then walking will not be convenient for anyone in that city. So I have always focused on the optional user, the user by choice who needs to be enticed out of the vehicle.
And I think, especially in like the last 10 years, or maybe because I'm in the profession, I have a skewed impression of when people really started thinking about how they experienced their community. I feel like in Lincoln, at least, it's been relatively recently that I have heard conversations from the general public around, oh yeah, we like being able to be like in our Haymarket district. Like we like the way we can experience this space. And I think that that's great. But one of the things that I've bumped into a lot is that even though we know that walking is better for you, better for your health, better for your community, a lot of our civically minded governing bodies don't necessarily they think that we're trying to make places look pretty or aesthetically pleasing, and they don't necessarily understand why we should be expending money in this way because they respond to the almighty dollar. And I think one of the excellent points that you make in your book is that the economic impact of a walkable place is massive. So can you expand on that for the podcast? I know we're talking to planners and they get it, but we do get some government officials as well.
We get some civilians or, yes, non-planners at least. So the whole practice of economic development in cities has changed dramatically over the past few decades, from trying to steal corporations away from other cities, from trying to create some sort of cluster like an aerospace cluster or a biotech cluster, to realizing that talent is mobile, that now post Zoom, talent is incredibly able to relocate almost anywhere that it wants to. And that the number one thing you can do to have a vital business community is to be a place where people want to be. And so that has refocused a lot of, pro-business and frankly, more conservative folks in the cities that I work in at demanding more walkability. Some of my successful projects are in places like Oklahoma City, which are quite red, suburban Indianapolis, Carmel, whoever gets nominated as a Republican becomes mayor. And I mean, it's, a lot of places like that. That's where I work, because the leadership understands that to have a future, they need to attract young talent, and young talent not only wants a great place, but they want a walkable place. They want a bikeable place. A lot of them are interested in transit if it can be decent. And so that's how you do economic development these days. When you paint a bike lane, for example, that's not just a bright green piece of infrastructure. That's like a horizontal billboard on the street that says, hey, cool people live here and you may want to live here too. So there's an economic development component to most of these things.
That wraps up part 1 of our conversation with Jeff Speck on Walkable City. Be sure to tune in next week to hear the rest of our conversation, where we get into how housing and walkability go hand in hand and how transit impacts both. We also discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on our cities and transitioning offices to residential, and then we wrap up with a long list of recommended readings. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.